Good afternoon. It is a great honor to be here with Professor Oriana Bandiera. Welcome to the EUI.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for having agreed to having this talk at the EUI. Your research spans from development issues to labor economics, and one of the most important contributions is actually the understanding of how can we actually get people to accept more effort in what they are doing. And you have contributed to this literature looking at the public and the private sectors. Can you give us an overview of your research and in particular how the results differ according to the setting?
Certainly. So this is a question that I've been exploring for many years now, and I've always been interested in understanding what motivates people. In the context of a labor relationship where an employer hires an employee to perform a task, incentives are mechanisms that are used for the employee to do what the employer wants him to. And the basic way in which incentives work is that the employer gives the employee something that the employee wants, that is money, in exchange for something that the employer wants, which is performance on the job. Now, the starting point for my research comes from the observation that people don't just care about money. They care about many other things. They care about the impact that they have on society. They care about people that surround them. They care about their family. They care about their friends. And all of these would be irrelevant if these sources of motivation didn't interact with the material incentives that people face. But in many cases, it turns out that they do. And so that's what my research looks at. My research looks at how material incentives, which are given in the context of a work relationship, interact with other motivators that people might have. That can prevent HIV, the incentives interact with the desire to prevent HIV. If we're looking at incentives in a firm where people are friends with their colleagues, this friendship affects the way incentives work. And so the way incentives depend on, the effect of incentives depend on the setting, depends fundamentally on how the setting shapes the other motivators that drive people's actions.
Thank you very much. Before going on with this topic, I would like to ask you something about the methodology that you use. In many papers you use field experiments, which are actually have been developed during the last decade or so. Can you explain in a very descriptive way what they consist of, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of these methodologies?
Certainly. So, you have to think that the main question that we're interested in is one of causality. That is, we're not interested in describing incentive schemes, we're interested in understanding how these incentive schemes cause changes in performance. It's very difficult to do so if you look at observational variation in incentive schemes and performance. Let me give you an example. Imagine researchers like aliens. Most people think that researchers are aliens anyway. So imagine that we live in a distant planet, and we send a probe to planet Earth, and the probe sends us back information. And one of the information that the probe sends us is the color of the sky and the number of umbrellas. And we see that when the sky is grey, there are more umbrellas. Now we want to know whether opening the umbrella causes the sky to be grey, or the greyness of the sky causes the umbrella to open, or if there is a third factor perhaps that causes both. Now with these two pieces of information we can't do much. But imagine now that as aliens, we have the power to run an experiment, and we take 100 cities on the Earth, and we put 50 of these cities, we open umbrellas at random, and in another 50 we don't. Now, because these cities have been chosen at random, they are equal in many dimensions. Some are at the sea, some are in the mountains, some are cold, some are hot, so there is no systematic difference between them. We can then study whether the opening of the umbrella causes the sky to become grey. Chances are that that's not the case. Now, if we can do the opposite, we can make clouds. We will see that where there are clouds, there will be more umbrellas. And it's precisely the capacity of creating this exogenous variation, we say in economics, that determines our ability to establish causality. And that's what field experiments do. Now, instead of thinking of umbrellas and the color of the sky, think of incentives and performance.
It's a fascinating example. Coming back to the previous point, the way workers react to incentives. When I was reading your papers, which actually refer, as we were saying before, to the public and the private sector, I thought how these incentives how these fundings actually can be translated in a setting like academia, that can be public or private according to the countries where we are in. But of course, researchers and professors can respond differently to monetary versus non-monetary incentives. Do you have any clues about this? Have you ever thought?
I have to be careful here because, of course, that might determine the type of incentives that I'm given in the future. I remember I once was discussing a paper where we find that non-monetary incentives have a great effect, and I was discussing this in front of my employer. And I thought that was a very intelligent idea. Yes. But so coming back to your question, the task of academics is always the same in the private or in the public sector. Is teaching and research. Of course, what might change is the objective of the university. A private university might have stronger incentives to please the students, so to raise fees, right? And so a private university might put more emphasis on teaching performance and on research performance. But the task of the academics is the same. Now, if you compare the monetary benefits to the non-monetary benefits, like awards, winning the Nobel Prize and the like, the key distinction is not between public and private. The key distinction is the institution that gives this award. In the first case, in the case of monetary incentives, it is the university itself that pays its professors to perform. In the second case, the case of prizes, is the research community as a whole that bestow this prize. So to the extent that individuals, academics, care more about the appreciation of their research community, then the prizes are going to be more effective. But I think it's not the nature of the prize in itself, but rather the nature of the organization and the community that's bestowing this prize.
Yeah, so it's the strength of the community itself that make the recognition more important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, it's very difficult to design an optimal price structure, both because the power of the prize depends on the scarcity, so you can't use it too much, otherwise it loses value. And because, given that it's bestowed by the entire community, it requires a lot of coordination. So we have prices, they do have effects, but they're by no means optimal. If they're optimal, it's just by chance.
Thank you very much. The last question was actually a step back. I was looking at your research from a broader point of view, because when I was reading your paper, yes, your the contribution in the economic literature is to understand how people react to incentives, how to maximize workers' effort. But then at the end, when you run your experiment in Africa, you see that these incentives have also an effect on ultimate outcomes like health prevention, health protection against AIDS, rather than women empowerment. I'm thinking to the paper that you run, with the experiment that you run in Uganda. Which policy implications you can derive from this?
So, I think the thing we have to understand is that, of course, the ultimate outcome is always welfare. So, effort and the performance of these agents is only an intermediate outcome, which eventually will lead to higher welfare, hopefully. But the reason why we focus in our research in measuring the performance of the agents is that this is what is directly attributable to them. So for instance, we recently wrote a paper where we wanted to provide incentives to agents engaged in the sales of condoms in Africa. And we gave them incentives as a function of sales. Of course, we don't care about sales per se, we care about condoms preventing HIV. But we couldn't have possibly given them incentives as a function of HIV prevention, because the people selling condoms can put in effort to sell the condom, but they can't follow people home and make sure that they use it. So incentives are effective only if you give them on a measure of performance that the agent can himself or herself affect. Giving them incentives is like I give you incentives to make sure that the weather stays nice today. You may try however hard you want. I doubt that the incentive can be effective regardless of your effort. So I think the fact that these papers look at the intermediate outcome is not to say that the final outcome is less important. To the contrary, it is crucial, and that's what drives the interest in these questions. But it is important for incentives to be effective that they are made conditional on measures that the agents themselves themselves can affect.
Yeah, but the nice thing is that at the end you also find an effect on the use.
Where we have looked, we have found an effect, yes.
That's a very good news.
Yes.
So I thank you very much, Oriana, for the time she dedicated to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.